a global marketplace of weapons. The export of arms is a multi-billion-dollar business unlike any other.
Can large defense contractors sway what the military buys, even though at times that's not necessarily what they want or need? Absolutely.
It can be argued that trading weapons is essential for countries' security in a dangerous and uncertain world.
And this industry, is what provides governments the means of self-defense.
But commercial motivations can influence controversial arms sales.
I think it's quite clear that in many cases the economic reasons are very important and are the final kind of reason why states continue with certain arms exports.
In this video, we'll look in depth at the global arms trade, who it serves, who profits from it, and who it hurts.
1/5 of the world's children right now are living in places of active armed conflict.
As war rages in Ukraine, the country's urgent need for weapons is undeniable. But is the global arms trade as it currently operates making the world safer or more dangerous? Find out on Business Beyond. So what exactly do we mean by the global arms trade? Governments spend a fortune on defence. Just under $2 trillion was spent globally in 2020. However, not all countries make their own weapons and military technology. They either buy from other countries or are granted weapons in the form of military aid. Combined, these deals are known as arms transfers.
Arms transfers, at least as CIPRI defines them, is the transfer of weapons between states. And transfer can be both trade in the economic sense of the word, weapons are being sold, or they are given away. Hence the reason that we don't call it trade per se, but that we refer to transfer it.
When we talk about the arms trade, we often refer to countries rather than companies. That's because while many privately run companies make weapons, the sector is tightly controlled and regulated by governments.
When companies sell arms, they usually don't give them away. They sell them with a permitted license from their respective governments. That is true in basically all countries in the world. So in that sense, all arms trade, all arms transferred are governed by the state. The companies cannot act alone in that regard. If they do so, then normally that is against the law.
But that's not to say that the sector isn't lucrative for the companies at the top. In 2020, the top 100 arms producing and military services companies recorded combined sales of $531 billion. That includes domestic sales within the country of origin. But much of the sector's sales are via arms transfers to other countries. CIPRI, that's short for Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which does extensive research in this area, says the value of the global arms trade was at least $118 billion in 2019. But it cautions that figure is likely to be a big underestimate. Several large countries, for example China, don't publish financial data on total arms exports or licenses. In the global arms trade, a handful of countries dominate the export market. Between 2016 and 2020, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, that's the USA, Russia, France, China and the UK, exported almost 80% of all weapons sold around the world, along with Germany. But one country towers above all the others when it comes to the export of weapons and military technology: the USA. In the 5 years from 2016 to 2020, the USA accounted for 37% of all arms exports. Little surprise then that the top 5 arms producing companies in the world by sales are all American: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics. And in 2022, business is strong.
In 2021, because that's really the springboard into 2022, companies bought back the largest US companies were able to buy back it's over $15 billion of their own stock. The balance sheets are relatively healthy. They maintain their operating margins, through the pandemic. They didn't seem to have a whole lot of, there were stresses, but they really didn't seem to have any critical problems in hiring people.
A consistent criticism of the arms trade and the defence sector in general is that it profits too much from conflict, meaning there may be a financial incentive to go to war beyond foreign policy or security considerations. The idea goes back a while. Over 60 years ago, in his farewell address as US President, Dwight Eisenhower talked about something called the military-industrial complex. He was referring to the relationship between the US military and the vast defence industry, and the risk of misplaced power falling upon that industry. Does the influence of defence companies lead to the production of more weapons and therefore more conflict around the world? Some experts dislike framing it as simply as that.
To be honest, I don't really like the phrase military-industrial complex because it carries a very, sort of like pejorative, connotation. It rings a bit like negative, because you need to understand that the arms industry, it has to be linked to the government in a way, because the main customer of this industry is governments. And this industry, is what provides governments the means of self-defense.
But others are more critical of how defence sector motivations can influence foreign policy.
It's certainly part of the problem. In many cases, these are deals that are being brokered by governments for industries that are being supplemented in various ways because of their manufacturing sector by those very same governments, and that governments both directly and indirectly profit from in terms of job creation, taxation, and various other things.
That's Samantha Nutt. Through her work with the humanitarian organisation War Child, she has campaigned for changes to how the arms trade functions. For example, calling for more transparency around weapons transfers and more humanitarian spending to counter its effects.
There is this sense that there are financial gains that are being made at the expense of civilian well-being. And the lack of transparency around that is one of the biggest impediments to both holding those companies accountable, but also holding our own governments accountable.
We approached a number of US and European defence companies, but none were available for interview. However, the Aerospace and Defence Industries Association of Europe, that's the trade body for the European defence sector, provided us with a statement. Asked if defence companies profit excessively from conflict around the world, the ASD said,
"The main mission of our industry is to help to protect peace and stability in Europe. Freedom and democracy are not a given. They do have enemies and, as history has shown, these enemies sometimes do not shrink back from using force. Defence industries provide our armed forces with the means to protect us against such threats. They therefore make an essential contribution to the security and freedom of European citizens. To remain a place of freedom and democracy, Europe needs to have an efficient indigenous defence industry."
We've already seen which countries export the most weapons around the world. But to understand more about the motivations behind those sales, we need to see where they go. These countries were the top 10 importers of arms for the years 2016 to 2020. The top 10 account for just over 50% of all foreign arms sales in that period. Around a quarter went to 3 countries: Saudi Arabia, India, and Egypt. Over the past few years, Saudi Arabia has caught up with India to become one of the world's biggest import markets for weapons. The USA has supplied almost 80% of Saudi weapons imports in that time. Weapons sales to Saudi Arabia surged under both the Obama and Trump presidencies.
Some of the things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered to Saudi Arabia very soon, and that's for their protection. But if you look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million, that's peanuts for you.
For several decades, Saudi Arabia has been a political ally of the US in the Middle East. But domestic US economic motivations have been touted as a major driver for the Saudi deals.
So, for example, already in 2011 under the Obama administration, when there was a very big contract for the sale of combat aircraft to Saudi Arabia. The argument of jobs and the importance for the economy was openly mentioned, together with those other reasons of supporting an ally in a dangerous environment.
But arms sales to Saudi Arabia have been hugely controversial because of the Saudi-led intervention against Houthi rebels in the ongoing Yemeni civil war. The UN says that by the end of 2021, 377,000 people had died in the Yemeni civil war, with around 150,000 of those civilians. The majority died from hunger and disease caused by the humanitarian disaster, while around 15,000 have died as a result of military action, many in airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition.
I think that Yemen is certainly one of the starkest examples, because we have evidence that weapons that were shipped to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia have been used in that conflict. So I think that has certainly, I think, exposed the scale of the problem.
It is not possible, according to many analysts, to defeat the Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, and therefore the Saudi war will not lead to peace. Even worse, over the past 6 years or so, it has only it has only contributed to a humanitarian catastrophe. So that has been a very important reason for the focus on arms exports to Saudi Arabia and calls to constrain, restrict, or even stop that.
The US is not alone in supplying the Saudis. The UK and France are the country's number 2 and 3 suppliers respectively. But pressure over the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen has seen several European countries, such as Sweden, the Netherlands and Germany, drastically cut back on arms exports to Saudi Arabia. Every day, the wars in Yemen and Ukraine remind us of the horrific effect of conflict on civilians. Anti-war and humanitarian campaigners often focus on the role the arms trade plays in fomenting and prolonging conflict, arguing that weapons originally sold for ostensibly legitimate purposes of defence or security will inevitably end up serving other ends.
All you have to do is look at the evidence, right? The evidence does not back up the claim that those arms are primarily being used by lawful militaries and for things like police enforcement. Even if you just look at small arms, the 1 billion that are the legal small arms that we know about in circulation in the world every year, 85% of those are in the hands of civilians.
Then there's the risk of weapons sold in the arms trade being used to engage in war crimes, human rights abuse or terrorism.
I think the important thing is here to spread the realization, spread the awareness among states that there are significant risks involved in exporting arms. The risk that either the arms are being used in the wrong way by the recipients, for example, in human rights abuses, etc., or that they contribute to states actually resorting to violence, or that they contribute to, for example, states even attacking other states, as also has happened in the past.
There are some agreed controls in the global arms trade aimed at preventing certain abuses.
Just for example, when there is a United Nations arms embargo, when the United Nations Security Council has decided that a certain country or a certain armed group should not receive arms, then that is international law. So you cannot supply weapons to Libya, you cannot supply weapons to groups in Somalia, etc., etc.
There is also the Arms Trade Treaty. That's a multilateral treaty that regulates the international trade in conventional weapons. 110 states have ratified it, although neither Russia nor the USA have done so. The EU also has rules and criteria it expects member states to adhere to before selling arms. However, experts say many of these measures aren't strong enough to deter national governments.
It really remains very much a national prerogative. So it's usually the final say and the final decision still is very much a national one.
Humanitarian organisations calling for change in the arms trade say one of the biggest challenges is convincing governments to spend less on its militaries and more on the kind of humanitarian aid which can, in the longer term, end cycles of violence in war-torn countries.
That's the great hypocrisy, because the countries that most benefit from the persistence of armed violence in the world are also the least likely to be engaged financially in trying to find peaceful, sustainable solutions through the eradication of poverty, through a reduction in global income inequality, and through things like humanitarian assistance.
As we speak, a devastating war is raging in Ukraine. If Russia's invasion has made the world a more dangerous place overnight, does that simply mean that the global sale of arms will grow and grow? Defence spending in Europe has been on the rise for a while now. Since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, NATO's European members have been spending more and more on defence each year.
However, what we're seeing now is an acceleration or deepening of this trend, because many countries are saying they're going to invest even more than they had planned. So it's going to grow, but even at a faster pace than it had started before the start of the war. So I would say that the Ukraine is rather the war in Ukraine is sort of deepening or strengthening the trend that was already there.
So does that automatically mean more profits for the defence sector?
That is what the commercial industry will do. The pharmaceutical industry has most likely benefited from COVID. There's nothing really wrong with that, but it is extremely important, as you already hinted at, to be able to control the industry. It should not be the industry that determines which decisions there are being taken about what should be acquired.
That control isn't limited to decision-making around exports. It could also come in the form of profit capping. That's an option available to governments in the US and Europe if it becomes clear that a dramatically changed security environment requires a huge increase in spending.
We're really in a new Cold War. Putin's, going to be around for another 10 or 15 years. Relations deteriorate further with China. There's sustained growth in U.S. defense spending at the same time, and European defense spending at the same time. You have all these other government needs, government demands for non-defense spending. I could see a period where there are more restraints put on profits or excess profits, and that's certainly something that's happened in the past in the defense sector. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened again in that environment.
Such a scenario might alter the perception that defence contractors welcome war, but it is unlikely to mean that the world is becoming a safer place. That's all from this edition of Business Beyond. For more from us, check out our playlist. Why not start with our recent video on sanctions and whether or not they really work? And if you like what we do, hit the like button and subscribe. Until the next time, take care.